We're going to give our participants just a few more minutes to join us. Please hold the line. Phantom. Thank you for holding on the line while we allowed the rest of the participants to join the call. This morning we have with us Jim Rickner, the Director of Training with Conquest Imaging. Jim comes with us with a wealth of experience working in electronics for over 30 years. 13 of those years were at the U.S. Air Force, working on a variety of electronic equipment. The last 10 years were in ultrasound, both in field service and repair. He is a renowned instructor and sought-out speaker in the industry, and having taught hundreds of biomedical engineers, BMETs, CBETs, he's well respected as a teacher who instructs from a field perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jim Rickner.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jackie, for the introduction. I'm really excited about today. Welcome, everyone. I hope you find this as beneficial as I do. I enjoy working on ultrasound systems, and particularly recently I've seen a need for people to learn more about how to use a piece of test equipment known as a phantom in the ultrasound industry. So today we're going to talk about image quality problems, and stand by for just a second. Some of the things we're going to talk about are how to verify image quality using a phantom, and when we're done with today's perspective, understanding the principles of image quality will be an important concept. We'll understand the relationship between frequency and resolution. We will be familiar with the different types of resolution. We'll define those for us. We will also understand the phantom and some of the measurements that we can use to verify image quality. And then we're going to go specifically over different tests that we can use while we're using a phantom to confirm the image quality. Image quality, well, that's kind of a tough one to define because it really is a somewhat subjective when you're talking ultrasound. You know, you talk to the sonographer and they use terms that are mushy, grainy, washed out, and you know, those are highly technical terms when you think about it, because you know, what do they mean? What does mushy mean to one sonographer as opposed to another? And that's hard for us to understand because we don't spend every day scanning different patients. You know, how has their image changed when they're describing this as mushy or grainy, or how has it changed? Can they give you an example over time? Can you show me a patient 2 weeks ago versus one today that illustrates why the image quality has suffered in the last few weeks? And that brings you to the degradation over time. So how can you prove that? Well, you need to have real life situations that illustrate the good versus now what they call the bad. And that really relies on what we call a customer interview. You need to really speak with the sonographer when they're talking image quality, because it is such a subjective thing that we encounter from day to day. As a matter of fact, I have actually changed customer interview to customer interrogation, because it seems like I just never have enough information when it comes to troubleshooting image quality. And so I've decided that I have to go beyond just asking them what's wrong. I really need to dig for the answers of what they're describing when they are talking about image quality issues. So image quality, by definition, consists of many different things when you're talking ultrasound. This is a brief description of each. We'll go into these a little more in depth in this presentation, but they all influence ultrasound image quality. And the first one, detail or spatial resolution, is the ability to distinguish very small structures, and this is both the axial and lateral resolution areas. Don't worry about axial and lateral quite yet. We will define those in this presentation. But really, what you need to understand is it's the ability to distinguish small structures. Then we go on to image uniformity, and it says comparable detail and contrast through the entire image. There's no way that we'd like to have really dark image at the surface or the near field, or maybe in the middle. We need to have a good uniform image from top to bottom and left to right, so that it looks like a nice consistent image throughout the entire image area. Contrast resolution. The basic definition is the ability to differentiate different tissue types without introducing noise. Again, we'll show you examples of these, but really contrast resolution is the ability to take different density materials or structures in the human body and show them on the screen in a way that allows you to differentiate them. Temporal resolution frame rate. This is simply the rate to acquire a frame and display it. So this is where you build your image from top to bottom, and as you do so, how long does it take you to do that? And we'll again define that in greater detail in a little while. Dynamic range, it's the ability to display the largest and smallest signals acquired and displayed. We're not talking largest and smallest objects now. We're talking about largest and smallest signals, which is basically the amplitude of the echo. And again, the amplitude of the echo will be defined shortly. Then we have spatial discrimination, the ability to limit artifacts and reflections from other locations. Other locations, we don't want to pick up artifacts from anywhere but the target location that we're firing for. And so the ability to eliminate anything else is known as spatial discrimination. And bandwidth goes really back to the dynamic range in large part, meaning these are the system's ability to display the least dense versus the most dense material to a grayscale. That's some of the basic definitions we use when we're talking image quality. So let's talk about more specifically some of these tests. We have axial resolution, and its definition is a minimum separation between two structures the ultrasound beam can distinguish between parallel to the beam path. And if you look at the slide here, you can clearly see there are two blue dots that are in the focus area. That's what the black curved lines indicate, is that we're being focused right where the two blue dots are. So we've narrowed our beam to that. And the fact that we can separate these two dots into two separate structures indicates that we have good axial resolution. Again, this is parallel to the beam path, but another way I like people kind of new to ultrasound to understand this is it's top to bottom. These objects are one on top of the other. They're very close to each other, and it's our ability to separate them into two structures as opposed to have them blur into one. If these two dots, for example, were in the near field or far field, they would no longer look like two objects. They would look like one larger oval object. So it's important to understand when we're talking resolution that this is the ability to separate two small objects instead of having them blur into one. So that's axial resolution, again, parallel to the beam path. Let's talk lateral resolution. In this case, we've got the same blue dots, except now lateral, they're talking about perpendicular to the ultrasound beam or side by side. I always remember lateral when I was new. because it was started with an L and that was left to right. So that was able for me to differentiate axial versus lateral. Lateral side by side or left to right. And this one we have a little bit better description because I wanted to kind of get to the idea is if you have the focus area in the middle like it is, the focus is so narrow that it can actually see the difference between two structures, whereas at the top or bottom of the image, the near field, far field, the focus is wider than the actual two dots, and therefore they will be blurred into one oblong structure, which would not represent good lateral resolution. On the left-hand side of the image, we have our phantom. Now, these pictures of the phantom are missing the actual measurements that are associated with the phantom, but there are specific measurements that you'll see on your phantom that give you ways to measure this. But the resolution array is simply that curve of dots, and you can clearly see that the dots become very close together, and our ability to differentiate those dots speaks to whether we have good or poor axial and lateral resolution. So I've added this little black and white image. This is a 2D image that represents axial and lateral resolution, and you can clearly see that the dots are starting to blur into one structure, which indicates in this case, since they're left to right, not top to bottom, that we have poor lateral resolution. Now, it's also important that you understand the importance of frequency when we're talking resolution. There's an important concept in ultrasound that the higher the frequency of the probe that we're using, the higher the resolution. The downside to that, or the thing that we lose, is the ability to penetrate. So the opposite's true. Low penetration gives you low resolution, but gives you high penetration. So the fact that you have poor, good or poor axial and lateral resolution may be just a factor of the frequency you're transmitting at. So please keep in mind that you have to be aware of that also. So in this case, if this was a 1.5 megahertz probe, we would not expect good lateral resolution. But you know, if we're using a higher frequency, that should improve. It's also important to know, and you'll see me mention it many times throughout this presentation, that you need to take hard copy printouts of these as you look at these different probes, different frequencies on a phantom, because what you're really looking for is degradation over time. So if 6 months earlier you had taken hard copy printouts and the same probe and the same frequency, same preset, looked better than this, then you know that there's been degradation, and you must investigate why at that point. What's changed on the system to cause this change in resolution? Transverse resolution is the next one, and it's really kind of an important concept to get a hold of. Its ability to differentiate structures side by side within the ultrasound beam across the image plane. So we've talked axial being top to bottom, lateral left to right. Well, now we're talking objects front to back, and there is a pretty substantial limitation. If we're talking 2D imaging, there is no such thing as transverse resolution. This would be resolution measured on a three-dimensional probe, 3D or 4D, because 2D imaging is simply a cross-section of the phantom. So it has no ability to look front and back on a traditional phantom. What you would require in this case would be a 3D, 4D probe to also add that third dimension of front to back. We also talked earlier about image uniformity, and image uniformity is basically saying that you want comparable detail and contrast to the entire image, and the image should look uniform from top to bottom. And what I mean by that is if you look at this image, certainly there are different density materials that make it appear that there's, darkness and or areas of darkness and white. But in reality, from top to bottom, this is a very uniform, clear image, as well as from left to right. So this is indicative of an image that you would be looking for. No dropouts, no gray or black areas, horizontal or vertical, that is not caused by, for example, shadowing from bones, because they'll generate or lose, excuse me, a lot of your acoustic power, and therefore they can cause shadowing below anything that you have that's a highly dense object. So this is a really good picture to look at. You'll be seeing it throughout the presentation because it gives a lot of information. We go on to contrast resolution, and I'm not sure how many of you actually have seen what we call the Phantom, the ATS model 539 Phantom. This is basically a reproduction of that, of the front of the Phantom without all the measurement information on it. But the circle surrounds different density materials, different objects that are significantly different densities, and it starts off at the white one, which is the highly dense material, and the dark one at the bottom, the minus 15 decibels, is your least dense material. And this is important for us to be able to look at these and differentiate the fact that they're different. So what do we do with these contrast resolutions? What's the importance of it? Well, if you're unable to see, for example, one of the 3 decibels, either the plus or minus 3 decibels in the image while you're scanning this phantom, what you're going to end up with is a problem that you won't be able to see for perhaps a cyst or a tumor in a patient because it's blending in with the background. So when you're looking at the different probes and evaluating for contrast resolution, what you really need to do is make sure that you can see these 6 objects as different. Not only the fact that you can physically see them, but that they're different and that you can resolve them from the actual background, which is your ballistic gel. So if you were unable to do that, diagnosis would be very difficult for certain density cysts. So it's important that you resolve down to these different decibel levels. So, how does it really work, ultrasound? Well, they apply a high voltage pulse to the transducer element, and this sends out a sound wave that travels through the human body. It interacts with various organs, and then the interactions cause reflected energy to travel back to the transducer, where each of its elements act as a receiver, and then they convert these signals into tiny electrical pulses, and then they're processed and produced or displayed on the monitor. And the reason I wanted to bring this up right now is we just talked about contrast resolution, and if you were to try to measure contrast resolution from the top of the phantom with the most dense material on top, what's going to happen is you're going to give up all your acoustic energy while trying to penetrate that one highly dense object, and you're going to end up with a huge shadow below it, and your reflected energy is going to be lost on all the other objects below it. So it's important that you understand that as you're going through different density materials, that you're not giving up all your energy right up front. It would be a much better process to turn the Phantom, the Model 539 Phantom, on its side and image these contrast markers where there is no interference with a different density of materials. So I just like to point that out. And again, just as we're talking about densities of material, I bring up this image, and we clearly have the dark spot just above the baby's forehead. That would be your amniotic fluid. Then we have kind of a lighter, almost white structure towards the top of the image. that would be your abdominal muscles. And then clearly we have the white in the baby's skull, and you can see the jaw, which is the very dense material in a baby. So different ways to display this. You can also see that in one case, the baby's hand, which appears to be top right of the image, produces a shadow below it because it's a very dense object, and you do get some shadowing right below it. So that's an example of what I'm referring to. Moving on to temporal resolution or frame rate. Um, Basically, frame rate is the rate that it takes to build an image on the ultrasound monitor. And there are different things that can affect it. Frequency will definitely affect it. So the frequency of the probe. Also, the number of focal zones can affect the fact of how quickly it's acquired or displayed. Now imagine a picture that you have to build from top to bottom at millions of times a second. And as you're doing this, you're targeting one specific spot in space, and then you're passing that information on. Then you target the next particular spot in space, and you do this over and over and over at millions of times a second. Well, the time it takes to build the entire image and get it displayed is one frame rate. And there's no real hard rule as to what the frame rate should be. But with a single focal zone, you're normally looking at the 20 to 30 hertz range, so 20 to 30 times a second a frame will be rebuilt. Now, as you add the number of focal zones, let's say you're looking at several regions of interest on an image, as you add the number of focal zones, your frame rate is going to go down because now the system's not only rebuilding the entire image, it has to go and refocus at every area of interest that you select as a sonographer or as a technologist, and as it rebuilds that, it slows your frame rate down. So as you add 2 or 3 or 4 focal zones, what you're going to sacrifice is your refresh rate. And in reality, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's really up to the sonographer to tell you, or for you to see. When imaging a phantom, there's nothing really moving, so the refresh rate is less important. But if you're looking at some object that's moving, it could appear or start to appear choppy if you put too many focal zones in there. So there is a sacrifice as you do this. So be aware if the system or the image seems a little choppy. Take a look at your frequency and take a look at the number of focal zones you have represented, and you can either increase or reduce those in an effort to improve the image. And again, here's your image that we're talking about. It's really hard to see, but if you look at the left-hand side of the image area, there is a little arrow or caret, some people call it, that points right at basically the top of the baby's forehead. It's on the left-hand side of the image. That is a focal zone. So you could increase the number of focal zones to 2 or 3 or 4 based on what the sonographer's area of interest is. So, and those can move up or down as well as increase the number. So, focal zones. Dynamic range, also known as contrast resolution. The largest and smallest signals acquired and displayed. And when you talk about that, you can see on the left-hand side of the image, there's a grayscale bar that goes from the darkest dark to the lightest light. So you have your darkest dark light, and then in the image, that's what's represented. And the dynamic range is simply saying that what is the least dense material that we can accurately represent in the image area without it being completely and totally black. Or what's the highest density material we can represent as white without it being blossomed and overwhelming. So that variance from the least dense to the most dense material is called dynamic range. So we just talked and kind of defined some of the things that are happening with phantom testing, things we're looking for. So when we do this, you have to realize what kind of accreditation your facility may be dealing with. Some facilities, they say they have no accreditation, and that's possible. But I find that in my experience that most hospitals have at least one department, normally women's imaging or breast center, that is almost always ACR, American College of Radiology, accredited. And when you are accredited, they have some very specific tests they like you to run. And some of them, or most of them, require a phantom. And again, Conquest uses the ATS model, 539 Phantom. I like this Phantom for many reasons. One, it has a 10-year warranty now. It does not require annual calibration, and it never evaporates and has to be recharged. So there are a lot of compelling reasons that I like this. There are other Phantoms out there. They image fine. I just like the versatility of the Phantom. As I was a senior engineer in Arizona, and I kept my Phantom in my trunk, and it, from anywhere from 30 degrees in Flagstaff to 120 in Phoenix in the summer. And as long as you brought it into the facility with you to use and allowed it to get somewhere near room temperature, the thing looks brand new at this point. So very reliable. And so let's talk about some of the testing that we perform on a Phantom or using a Phantom and the importance of these. So sensitivity penetration testing. They're the same thing. You may hear some people call it penetration testing, but in reality, they define it as sensitivity, which is a maximum depth of penetration. And it's the ability to display weak echo from small objects. And as we look at Phantoms later, you'll see that there's some very small objects, and it's important for us to look at what depth we can see those at. Because clearly the way we want to do this is find an irregular cyst or at the very earliest time. So the ability to resolve that early at as deep as possible is clearly the way to go. So we'll talk more about that. But then we have axial and lateral resolution, which we defined. Axial is top to bottom, lateral is left to right. And it's the ability to get this detail and contrast and separate the small objects into two clearly definable objects. We have contrast resolution, which is the ability to differentiate different tissue types, which really, in a different way of saying that, is different tissue densities without introducing noise. So at that, we'll define that more. Again, we've kind of already talked about it. Geometric accuracy. It's the rate to acquire frames. That's actually not true. I apologize for that. Vertical, basically, geometric accuracy on a vertical is the ability to measure two points that are highly echogenic and resolve them down to a known distance. And we'll talk more about that as we go. Geometric accuracy. Lateral is the ability to do it also, but this time it's from left to right. So let's go more on to sensitivity and penetration testing to talk more about it. It's the ability to display weak echoes from small objects. Extremely important to correctly interpret and diagnose. We kind of already talked about that. Early detection is key in a lot of diagnosis. So the fact that we can do that is, it's very important. Obviously, the max depth that we can see is affected by output power, time gain compensation or control, the overall gain. And clearly, we talked about frequency earlier in the presentation, low frequency, high penetration, but low resolution. And then the ability of us to focus on a particular spot in the image to see what we can find. Now, the way ACR defines this is that you want to affect these things. You want to you want to scan in all frequencies, but you want to do all frequency with the highest output power, proper time gain control, and gain to give you a consistent uniform image from top to bottom. You want to do it on all frequencies, and you want to do it with a single focal zone at the deep region so that you can define. We're not looking for a clear image necessarily from top to bottom. We're trying at this point to see how deep this probe can penetrate and resolve to that smallest object. And then it's important that you record, as I mentioned earlier, all your findings on hard copies. If you have a printer, print it out, leave it with a system, maybe make a copy for yourself so that if they get lost, you have something to refer to. But what you're really looking, these findings should remain constant. There should be absolutely no degradation over time. And if you're starting to see degradation over time, then it's time for you to start evaluating. Is it the probe? Is it the system? Is it my printer even? Does the printer print it out the way it looks on the screen? So at this point, if it becomes inconsistent, you need to start evaluating what is going on with the system and make the proper repairs to bring it back to its original state. And in axial and lateral resolution, again, we get back to the phantom that has a resolution array. And resolution is the minimum separation between two closely spaced objects that can be imaged separately. Again, if I was imaging with a fairly high frequency probe, I would expect my resolution to look just like it does on the phantom, not blurred together, no objects coming together. But as I go down to the lower frequencies, some of this may start to blend together. You may kind of see that they're separate, but they're still touching or blurred a little bit together. Again, establishing a baseline to begin with when you first bring the system into service will help you to see if this was the way it looked 6 months ago or 2 years ago, because you have the ability to look at it over time. Axial, again, is parallel to the beam, which is top to bottom. Lateral is perpendicular to the beam, which means left to right. Poor resolution means the two objects will appear as one. Again, frequency dependent. Again, I can't emphasize the need for hard copy printouts so that you can have the consistent findings over time. Again, what you're looking for specifically is degradation over time. That's what ACR wants to be able to see and report to. So axial and lateral. Contrast resolution, which is also called displayed dynamic range. It's the ability to differentiate different tissue types without introducing noise. And we already looked at the six different density materials. And basically the way the system works is it uses the amplitude of the received echoes mapped to a grayscale. And clearly the more dense the material, the larger the echo is going to be. And I always kind of take this back to if anybody's ever been in soundproof rooms, it's got the foam material kind of coned, and so the cones reflect at an angle and absorb, so they don't get a really good echo off of them. In fact, very little echo off of them. So that would be mapped in this case as the grayest gray or almost black. And that's what the next line says. Darkest displayed gray equals the least dense material, where the white display equals the most dense material. And clearly in this image on the right, we have the least dense being the amniotic fluid, the most dense being the forehead and the jaw area. So again, when you're evaluating this, hard copy printouts so that you can look for degradation over time. You know, it seems like I keep saying that, but it's a principle that it's only going to help you. If you have images of the system when it was in its fully functional state, and you can come in with your phantom to evaluate this this image quality problem that the technologist or sonographer is talking to you about, well, then you have hard copy printouts to go back and look at and compare to the ones you're looking at today. And I can't tell you how much nicer it is to have something like that to evaluate than nothing at all. If you have nothing at all, put it back on your technologist, on your sonographer to show you images of when they said that the image was good versus what it is now. But in either case, having something to compare it to will really benefit you when troubleshooting image quality issues. Then we get to the geometric accuracy, vertical measurements and lateral measurements. It's basically, this is critical for accurate diagnosis of problems. If you had a cyst or an even healthy baby and you're measuring the measurement for the forehead to see how old the baby is and if it's maturing at the proper rate, if you don't have accurate vertical and horizontal measurements, then all your calculations will be thrown off. So really verifying this is very important. And they give you, obviously on this picture on the right, there are no measurements information on it, but on your actual 539 Phantom, there will be very specific places where you can measure to see if your calipers are measuring accurately. So you need to find these different places on your Phantoms and do the measurements and get hard copy printouts so that you can confirm that the system's working correctly. Now, you don't need to do this with every probe per se, but you definitely want to have a good set of printouts that illustrate that your calipers are working accurately. One note is, I mentioned earlier, I kept my Phantom in the trunk, 120 degrees in Phoenix versus 30 degrees in Flagstaff. The temperature of the Phantom can drastically change your measurements because it changes the speed of sound in the materials it's traveling through. So if you're getting inaccurate measurements, make sure that your Phantom is at room temperature, and if it's not quite at room temperatures, then continue on with your preventative maintenance or do some other troubleshooting while your Phantom gets back to room or close to room temperature, and see if that affects your measurements. There really isn't much you can do. It's a software-based calculation on most modern systems, so there is no adjustment you can make electronically to recalibrate your calipers. If they're off and it's not temperature related, then I recommend probably attempting a software reload and seeing if that brings the measurements back into tolerance. And just a note, vertical distance errors are far less likely to occur than horizontal. And as you're imaging a Phantom, you'll see that the dots tend to smear left to right more than they do top to bottom. It's just a characteristic of ultrasound. One of the things you can do to minimize that particular error is making sure that you have your focal positions kind of focused on the objects that you're measuring, so that if your focus is below or above where you're actually measuring, you may have a little distortion. So make sure you set your focus points appropriately for the area that you're using to measure on the Phantom. And that's really all I have today. There's a lot of information on this, and I will open this up for question and answers. If you want to chat your questions into us, that'd be great. And if I don't answer them immediately, don't worry. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and get them, and if you provided your email address, I can email the answers to your questions. I want to thank everybody for attending today. We had a really good turnout, and I think it is important information if you're working with ultrasound. If you had to leave early, we're going to have this presentation available for download. You can, and also there are hyperlinks available to our website that go to our upcoming webinars. We have classroom training. We have our training calendar out there, and we also have a hyperlink that goes right to the page where it has the courses we offer as well as syllabuses. So please, if you have any questions, contact us, and we'll answer any questions that you have. Again, I want to thank you all for coming.